So yeah, going ahead and starting recording. You should have just got the alert that we're recording. So today we're doing our last session of the term, and so all term we've been talking broadly about this concept of altruism, and then we've been engaged in it at different levels. One, just like merely conceptually, what is altruism? Is it possible to do things? And we talked about conceptually what we should understand the term to mean. And then more recently, we begin getting more and more practical. And so last time we were talking about, is altruism or philanthropy in particular something that maybe is in tension with or a problem for something like democracy. And today we're taking it to a little more of an international level, and we're thinking about altruism or philanthropy in the terms of like global aid. So this is probably the most political in the sense of political compared to ethics. This is the most political discussion we're going to have. So thinking rather about individual actions, but how should states or maybe corporations or something, firms like that, how should they think about giving to other organizations or other groups abroad? And so the discussion was a philosophy talk, one which we've used several times before here. And they brought on an economist too, who had several critiques of altruism as it's been carried out in the past. And so that's about as much summary as I'll give at this moment. So I was referencing the PowerPoint. But yeah, does anyone have things that came to mind listening? Not the PowerPoint, sorry, the podcast. Anyone have things that came to mind how we started discussion? And sorry, is the last thing. Because this is the last discussion, I think we'll start on the political foreign aid stuff. But really, anything should be on the table because I have tried to theme this term's discussion such that we don't need to be stuck on this podcast if it's not as fruitful. So yeah, who has thoughts about if they got a chance to listen to the podcast, or if not, wing it.
I'll just say that it seemed really complicated as a topic. I had not considered it much, but just hearing all these arguments just made me feel like I really don't have a good sense of what I believe about whether and how to distribute aid to other countries. So, and the economic arguments, I mean, even, at the level of expertise that I don't have, I can't really evaluate. Um, so, I'm just putting my position out there and see, wait to see what others think as well.
I completely agreed, Alex. I know less, I feel like now. I know what I don't know a lot now, which is a lot apparently. And it was fascinating. One of the things we've talked about, effective altruism earlier, and they talked about giving malaria nets, and that was brought up as one of the examples that some places use the nets as fishing nets. Though it's not even being used, which I guess isn't that bad of a thing, right? If someone's being productive with it, it's their choice to do it. It made me wonder too, like, why is it that we send malaria nets and why isn't there just a factory that produces the nets there and employs the local population to make the nets? What? And is it political, in fact? Like this, where do the nets come from, in fact? I don't even know that. Who who matches with what? There's so many unknown factors, and it's so funny that this is today's topic, right? It's actually very this talk was what 7 years ago, I think, 2017 or 8 years ago.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
US aid is extremely politically relevant right now. Those are like 2,000 or 200 employees something now, and all the aid is stopping and the things about disease. And it makes you wonder, yeah, I mean, is there corruption actually? I'm disappointed in the lack of evidence provided often with the governmental decisions that happen. It's like I try not to just take things at face value. But yeah, I feel like the corruption or the improper usage of things, I wish was more documented and publicly knowledgeable because it informs our decisions about, yeah, it sounds nice to help people, but is it actually helping? I feel like that's one of the core things today. Is it aid or injury? I guess the article, the podcast title. I still wonder how we can actually suss that out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's so funny, Jason, that you mentioned the mosquito nets because I paused the podcast at that point. I was like, wait a minute, we definitely talked about this with effective altruism, and then I had to reframe everything that I was thinking when we talked about it for that meeting. As specifically the idea that it's more like it can be viewed as paternalistic, Western giving rather than effective altruism, right? So how is that intersection, or how are those two things at odds with each other, is something I'm still hoping that we can talk about and thinking of myself.
Marcus, did you have everyone else jumped in? Did you have any thoughts you wanted to say? Oh yeah, you unmuted. So
Yeah, I was thinking about how they were addressing like the targeted aid efforts versus development aid efforts as well. But it was kind of interesting to see the two in the initial beginning, just kind of how they started off the podcast. Also, like where you would think there would be like more agreement, there was just like a lot more calling out audacity of Western understanding and implication of what we feel is great for your, society being created or rebuilt, and Western ideology of like, we know what's best for you and we want to make sure we have aid that supports these efforts that we think should go to these particular entities. And it made me think about it just in my doctoral research regarding communication, just how much the Western ideal is this kind of like prominent in terms of audacity, where we assume it is chief among all efforts and all communications, and is the model, to kind of be built after. But then you see so much of like where we falter and how we are highlighted in the public on a national or international scale. And it kind of made me take a step back as well and think about, kind of cover what everyone else is saying. Um, but it's a peculiar conversation only because it just seems like it just goes in this circle where we're like, well, we think we're good for you and we're going to give you money to make you like us, but we're also being publicized for how much we are, falling behind in so many different ways.
yeah,
We're good
yeah,
on textbook cover, not just so good in the details.
Yeah, before Josh
yeah.
comes in, I just want to jump on the in a circle, right? And it's like what Ian said too, or what Alex, like where do we go from here? Right? We're at the last session. Can we have altruism real? Like, is there actually real aid? And I just feel like I'm convinced that it's like all aid is a type of political act or a self-interested act, in fact. At the beginning of the podcast, the two podcasters were the hosts were kind of having this argument that they created, and it was all ideological, right? In a vacuum about knowledge and ethics. But I think the economist brought in the real world context that we can't take ourselves out of, like we ever actually. When we give to someone, there's a context there always. And isn't that fascinating that we often theorize or I idealize like some concepts, like it's good to give to people, but maybe we neglect too much as people this thought that your actions have consequences, and people do not act in a vacuum, is my point. We kind of bring in all of our prior goals and ambitions and preferences into everything we do. Is it even possible to even think about aid being just for the sake of for goodness sake, so to speak? I guess I contend it's really not, is what it feels like based on the context of the type of world we live in. Or I'd be interested, yeah, if we could argue that we can have some. Can we save proper true altruism? I don't know. It feels like it's on its last breath at this time. That I'm curious what y'all think.
I mean, I'm definitely going to drop my Cash App at the end of the discussion. So if you want to try and do pure altruism, give it to me. I know maybe we've developed some friendships, so it's not as clean as we'd want, but what are we going to do?
Yeah.
I do think one thing I wanted to just to draw attention to, because I do kind of feel like a little bit the podcast was a bit of a bait and switch. And as I remember, and then as I re-listened to it this time, I was like, oh, there really wasn't as much talk of the philosophical or the ideological discussion, which feels like one of the places where we could like okay, we do need to look empirically at what the world is, but like we might have the relevant expertise based on what values we happen to think are important, you know. So the earlier discussions about autonomy and how important that was one that we could say autonomy is important, and then okay, how do we best implement that? But then the economist, who I love, by the way, or I mean, I love that he was on and we had the discussion. Like a lot of those things, I don't have the expertise as Alex started. I don't have the grounds to like cut one way or the other on whether we should agree with this or that thing. But I did like one, how that did draw our attention to the fact that this context matters, as Jason says. And I really like the brief historical lesson, which I totally forgot about until I listened to it again yesterday. And so like reminding us of like, so the way in which aid has changed, like foreign aid has changed. So in the 60s, it was all about infrastructure. And it was largely Soviet Union versus USA. And then there was a shift to focus on poverty and women, right, and poor in the 70s. And then there was this shift to, well, this austerity era of the 80s. Then the USSR collapses, and so it's just pure strengthening democracy, or what a lot of countries know is like structural adjustment plans and austerity, and like, okay, you have to cut all your social programs if you want your debt forgiven. And so like noticing how the like at least the political aims of like the eras had their own like, what were they trying to do? So there's one is like, you might think one of those four different stories, and now maybe we have a different story today, is more or less a good way to do things for some sort of ethical reasons. But then like also we have to see, okay, did those things seem to help? And that's, I think, where the economists came in and putting the pressure on, like, did it help, right? And so that was one thing. And then also because this is the most political discussion, it's interesting maybe how some of the views or thoughts we have might shift from even when we're talking about effective altruism or we're talking about the democracy one was a little bit political, but like there's like what individually do we think? So maybe we want to promote autonomy. That was a big thing in the effective altruism debate. And right, that one guy's big issue was like these effective altruists don't care about autonomy enough. And instead they want to do this other thing. But then the economist was like, yeah, no, we can't be giving cash. When we give cash to these people, we end up giving cash to corrupt leaders, and then it doesn't work. And so it's like, it's interesting to see how the argument almost flipped, where like, what the thing that is most effective in some sort of political level, or if you're thinking nation state to nation state or whatever, at least according to the economists, is like the in-kind aid was the way to go. Versus like when we were thinking what are we giving individuals? If I'm thinking, do I give to Ian? Maybe autonomy has a stronger place. Versus I'm thinking, if I give to Be Better Club, does that something about that make a shift? Well, certainly this discussion seems to suggest there's some important shift there, which I think sometimes we collapse the ethical and the political, and this is just, I don't know, maybe there's not. I put too much on the table there, but I was just flagging where we have relevant expertise or not, like what discussion we can have without that expertise. And then second, the shift here between like the individual person to person, or maybe small group versus like a whole nation or a economic bloc to another whole nation or economic bloc. Those are interesting lenses that might shift our thinking. All right, I'm gonna turn it over again a bit. So there's loads on the table.
So I should say, like at a philosophical level, right? In principle, I do think it's good to be giving aid. And I see, like the conversation that the podcast started. I think there's good forward-looking and backward-looking reasons for doing so, right? And so in that sense, I can, without hesitating, say there is some obligation to support those who have needs that are not met, that are especially foundational needs, right? Like if people are starving, there's excess food, there's no reason, throwing away more food when you have that, and you can just give it to help people.
Alex, can I just have you, the
Mhm.
forward looking and backward looking? Could you, I mean, I know what you mean, but maybe some of us don't hear.
Oh, yeah. So
Because
like,
yeah.
Ian, based again, like thinking of the debate that was in the podcast, the backward looking reason that they gave there was reparations for taking resources, and these resources can be whatever we're coming to extract, mine in your area, and not really pay our due, or when the institution of slavery, taking literally human resources that were costly to the buildup of these economies, et cetera. You can think of these resources in many different ways. So kind of compensating for what would have been, you're assuming, an economic development that would have happened had these countries have access to their own resources. Now, the forward looking is the more humanitarian component that they provided in the podcasts where they're talking about, if you have the ability to help, they mentioned duty to rescue, right? If you have the ability to help and people are suffering and they need that, and it's much more of a burden for them than it is for you to help, for them to not receive any help, then that is a forward-looking obligation in
Right.
terms of helping them to improve their life in the future.
Yeah.
So that's how
Like, are we
I was
helping because
thinking
we've
about it.
wronged them versus helping because we can do some good, right? And
Yeah,
that's one of the
yeah.
distinctions. But I think that the Deborah Stats, and I forget his name, had that little debate in the front, which is like,
Yeah,
are we doing
and
this because of, yeah.
yeah, and I think there's good reasons that we don't need to spend time here thinking and debating about. For me, I think there's good reasons for both a forward and backward looking, but at the end of the day, what that amounts to is, okay, we have an obligation to give aid, but then the question is, how do we do that? Because on one hand, you can say, like you were saying, Josh, right? Okay, respecting the autonomy of people, just making it so everyone can get aid and everyone can use it in whatever way they think is most helpful for their families. But another matters, if you don't have certain institutions that allow people to participate in the economy or improve their life, or then you want to provide aid at a more structural level. And then you have paternalism coming into play, right? Are our institutions better? Are democratic institutions, free markets, etc., better, even if, or, even if there are better for us? What if people don't want them, right? You can say, oh, ideologically, they don't know that it's better. That's the purely paternalistic argument, but we do. Um, and so it doesn't matter if they prefer an authoritarian government, just give the money to the government and they'll use it in whatever way they see fit. But I don't know. I think it's a very complicated matter, especially because there are so many different interests and stakeholders at any given context, that there's really no way of satisfying everything, I guess, right? Whatever approach you decide, some people will benefit and some people will be harmed. And so I don't think it's as easy as, let's take out the ledger, do a cost benefit analysis, see how much benefit versus how much cost, and give that aid that way, because there's always going to be some people who are satisfied and some people who are not dissatisfied, who are not satisfied. And so this aid versus injury debate seems a lot more nuanced and complicated than it is to just, tally up, is it overall a net benefit or a net cost? Especially because not everything is quantifiable, right? There are some values, at least, that we who live in liberal democracies consider important, right? That you cannot really put a price on, right? The ability to express your political beliefs through voting, right? Even if that might lead to a society that is less financially beneficial for you, might have value that is not necessarily reducible to whatever cost you might have with a less liberal government that will improve your, salary or something like that. So again, I know this did not help at all. It just made the debate more confusing, I guess, in my mind at least. But it really all comes down to, and I would assume everyone here agrees that aid is a good thing based on these obligations. But then when you start thinking, even at a philosophical level, let alone the empirical, what happens on the ground when you start to distribute it, it just gets so complicated and messy so fast that it's not even easy to draw conclusions in principle, if not in practice as well.
Yeah, Alex, I thank you so much for that recap. It was super eloquent. Two things to respond to that, and playing devil's advocate for one side. Two, I want to talk about trade, not aid, proposition the economist suggested. But before that, I want to talk about an assumption you made that we think aid is worth giving. And I think yes, but in the self-interested way, there are people in need in people's own countries. So I think it's the country to country aid can be questioned. I want to wonder, I mean, all of this aid from one country going to another is, I assume, raised through taxes, especially. I think they said $50 billion was sent in aid from the US. What if those $50 billion were never collected, in fact, and our population kept that? What would the impact of that be on? Because there's also people in poverty and hunger and in need. If we could more effectively distribute the resources internally. I've had lots of fights about this exact subject with friends. I remember in high school back then about we of course we have to care about people abroad, and my friend was completely beholden to the thought that we should only care about people in the United States. And I think as I've matured more, I feel like I can see both sides. I kind of believe I think in one of our articles, it was like, just give a little bit to everyone approach. Like, let's just don't go all in on one thing. I mean, obviously there is a welfare system in the United States, at least specifically, right? So we have something, but what knob and dial and the amount is maybe the question as well. That's even worth giving. So my summary of that is, sure, aid could be nice, but to whom should it be sent? And does that meet our needs? Whoever that person is deciding. And maybe it'd be easier just to remove part of the decision to just let individuals decide where their money goes. You know, each of us have the freedom to donate to an international NGO that does good, and maybe if enough people did that, it'd be better. Does it need to be orchestrated through our government? Maybe not. Not sure about that, right? So I think the sense of the organizational or the individual level comes back to play here. Yeah.
I think one thing that feels like interesting, and just because this is like the most political discussion, I feel like this is a place to jump in, is like one of the things that for me seems important. So, right, one of the comments we often hear is like, well, you can individually help this person, or you individually. And I wonder, like, there's like certain benefits from like a state doing it. Like, how much capacity do I, even if I have a lot of money, have to realize something like strengthening democracy, qua my donations, versus like a state who has powers like sanctions and so forth. And so obviously Wellburn says, no, we should have trade. We shouldn't use sanction. We shouldn't use tariff. There's political discussions of that now, but like there's a way in which like it's a tool that, right, really states have, in particular states with a lot of power like the US. And like, so I'm wondering like how does that shift our thinking about, like, I mean, maybe the answer should be settled by, okay, what ends do we want to realize? We want to realize reduction in poverty. We want to realize maybe promote democracy, whatever. And maybe that's just, and then you figure out whatever you can do to do that. But I wonder if there's also something with the nature of it, like, you know, when the United States government decides to give aid in a way that strengthens democracy, assuming it's ever actually done that, right? Then doesn't that have like a sort of status that like is different than Jason individually or Ian individually or I individually doing it? Like maybe it signals like, okay, we collectively have made a choice. And so in democracy or in political theory literature, sometimes we suggest there's something special about that. Like, you know, even though we might all have disagreements, so 3 of us think we should focus on strengthening democracy, 2 of us think focus on reducing poverty. But if the group decides to do this and then we kind of go along with it, we're all contributing it, sometimes this idea that's creating a sort of legitimacy in that act. And so maybe there's like something special going on here by like the fact that like we're demonstrating a way of doing things that involves compromise, that involves blah, blah, blah. And so that was too long-winded. I guess I should just rephrase it as like, is there something special about us doing it together, or a nation state doing it together, that warrants a different sort of answer? Or is the answer of what we should do completely settled by, do we want to reduce poverty or whatever? And then we think using tariffs is just one tool for doing that. Me giving money is just one tool, blah, blah, blah. Or is there something different like about the nature of it happening as a political group, in this case, a nation or something, that is significant? Does that question make sense? Or that thought make sense? Because sometimes in political theory, they talk about there being something important there.
I think there's a major distinction between grassroots movements and the power that the people have in their effects, right? So us lay people, let's say, people without and not in positions of power, coming together for movements creates legitimacy, right? We have all sorts of grassroots movements that have made great change in the world. when it's done at like the nation state level or just giant national organizations, who are the types of people in these organizations, right? Already people with monumental wealth and power, even open philanthropy, right, is founded by Silicon Valley startup creators and venture capitalists, right? They have already so much power because of their wealth, and they can kind of inform, almost get to like hide behind the organization because and not stand out as an individual purposefully is sort of fascinating, right? The grassroots movement at least like combines a lot of voices, and so I think you can do top down or bottom up and be legitimate. And I just feel like recently I've been just more realizing the differences between just the middle and lower classes versus upper classes in power, and even the type of education that people have. I feel like if average Americans wanted to do the same thing, they do it already. There are lots of nonprofits today that do good things.
I think,
right?
I see that, and so I'm trying to draw a distinction between like the one question is, okay, let's say what the only thing we care about is reducing poverty, and then you might think, okay, we assess what we should do based on how much it reduces poverty, and maybe the state has tools that make it more effective at doing that versus you and I, or maybe it doesn't. That's like one question, and then like so the whole answer essentially would be settled by how much it reduces poverty. But I wonder if there's like another thing about like the nature of the fact that like even if it was equally good that just Jason and I, rich and powerful as we are, individually reduce poverty, is there something special or important about like it's not Jason and I, it's actually the US government, it's all 5 of us or whatever coming together in some way that like does that give a different sort of weight or something to it that like that might make, is there something important there about the way that this process is happening independently of just the outcomes? I guess that's the way I was thinking.
I guess,
And
Josh, I was trying to say it wouldn't look like it came from you and me. It would look like it
Yeah.
came from whatever organization represents us. And what we're saying is
Yeah.
the US isn't that organization. Perhaps it's just some US
Sure.
citizens concerned for reducing poverty org that was grassroots funded, right? And with enough of a movement behind it, it could have legitimacy still. And I think it's still to another person be like, wow, there's a lot of people. Let's say our hypothetical organization has 100,000 people in it, that collect money and that all agree that this is the type of aid we want. It's sort of different than the US, who taxes all citizens and decides, but our representatives to budget it however they see fit, right? It's a little different, right? Because we had more control in the deciding where that money went, and I contend that it can still seem legitimate and powerful to the recipient.
Yeah.
But yes, if they can't see who it came from, or it's a little more different. The anonymous,
I guess
stuff.
Yeah, I was thinking like if we imagine like the USSR versus the United States, or the United States led bloc, or if we imagine like the US versus China, like different processes by which decisions are made, different processes, like imagine they were equally effective at doing whatever it is they're trying to do, reduce poverty. Might we think there's something special or important there that like makes our answer? So yeah, maybe for you and I individually, all that matters is reducing poverty. But there's something different and important maybe that like we're doing this in some democratic manner or some collective manner or some, and so I guess that's actually this not even really centrally discussed in this. Actually, I don't even think it's perfectly discussed in this episode, but it's one of those things that sometimes I can be tempted by, because sometimes I try and oversimplify. Only thing that matters is the consequences. Actually, often I try and do that. But a critique that often comes up, or a concern a lot of people have, is that no, that's missing something. There's something about the process. In this case, it's not China's top-down, let's oversimplify, authoritarian model. It's the United States' bottom-up, electoral democratic model, blah, 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 in the ideal vision of it, right? That's making it. And there's like, even if they were equally effective, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know where I was going with that. There's different angles here, but I was thinking like there could be something like that. Or even, I'll pause very quickly, but like, if you think of the Cold War politics, this framed it as largely it was just 2 powerful blocs trying to get people on their side. But there's another vision of that like, oh, the US is supporting a bunch of right-wing dictatorships. The communists are trying to support communist movements. If you buy the Kool-Aid of those movements, right, like there's something ideologically different there about like one side doing whatever they can to just keep a country under its sphere of influence. Another side funding these like guerrilla movements that are like overthrowing these dictatorships. And like now we know looking back, there's more than that because, you know, but like there could be something importantly different there. And so like I don't know. That was off topic, I guess. The idea was like something symbolic or something process oriented that's independent of the outcomes that might be important. That would only apply in this collective way. I don't know. I guess it wouldn't only apply. Yeah, I'm gonna step back. I'm gonna really, I promise.
Josh is
Josh, were you? Oh,
oh sorry.
Ian, go ahead.
Okay, I'll be fast.
Mhm.
Is part of this the perception of the people or entities receiving, right? So do they see it differently if it's from an individual donor versus a grassroots thing versus a country? And if it is a country or some other state, then is that what you're getting at? Like there's this different perception of like the strings attached if it's USSR versus USA, right? Is it something like that?
Yeah, well, there's like this is so hard to do, right? To just draw a distinction between like what's actually going on, but like so partly the perception, but like I think there could be maybe we could at least imagine, even if it in reality wasn't, there could be something more than just a perception. There really could be an ideological thing. Like the 90s, the thing was strengthening democracy. Imagine, let's put aside what was really going on or what we might think is really going on. If that's what's going on, and it's democracy trying to strengthen democracy because it thinks democracy is valuable, or it's a communist country trying to promote communism because it thinks it's valuable, that feels like different than like I'm just choosing whatever people are going to support my economic interests or support my blah blah blah. Now, the problem is often those things overlap, but like I mean, this actually goes to the altruism thing. Like, right, if I'm giving money or the United States government's giving money to promote democracy, even if it undermines our like direct US interests and like how much money we can give, if it wasn't neocolonialism, like we really are doing this because it benefits us, that's a different thing. That seems more altruistic at a group level than I'm giving to Saharta or I'm giving to, you know, whoever, I'm giving to this dictatorship or that one because I want to keep them out of the Soviet influence. And, you know, like that's a more self-interested reason. That's interested, like it benefits my country. A problem is, of course, that we think democracy benefits all democracies, or we think trade benefits the country, or it is you buy this argument. It has this mutual benefit, but like it feels like in principle we can imagine I'm giving to these countries to support democracy because I care about it, even if I don't know it reduces my standard of living, or even if it means I'm less competitive against the socialists because you know they're going to elect some socialist government or something. Like I care about democracy independently, you know, of whether they're going to end up in my block or not. That feels like more altruistic, and so I think that lens of altruism versus some sort of mutual aid or some sort of other thing can come back in here. Um, this is an aside from, I guess, that earlier discussion of something special about the group versus the individual giving. But did that answer at all? I don't know. Yeah.
I have
I mean, another thing
oh,
yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
Josh.
Alex, no.
I just have a question about resources, but I remember that Marcus wanted to jump in with something, so I don't want to change the subject quite yet.
No, mine was pretty more for clarifying question. I know like Josh was trying to lead to individual versus collective effort. Um, but it made me think kind of Jason was mentioning something earlier that I was just kind of considering. I was like, I don't know if many of us, or at least most Americans, are altruistic in any capacity to do most things individually as a contribution. I think we mostly move in concert with one another. And many efforts, as far as like the targeted aid efforts that are kind of come about, most of the times the donations that come out of that are not really people who have researched or know much about what the cause is beyond a quick, 1 minute elevator pitch, and they just contribute or whatever, they just throw the money there. So it made me think about how most of the success in some of those targeted aid benefits are mostly because things are moving in concert as a collective, where we could say, instead of this is being a Josh Kissel, donation, this is UCF Center of Ethics donation, and showing that there's like a backing of support as a collective behind. There's more tangible evidence of like a longevity in terms of relationship building and cultivation, as opposed to this one-off, like, hey, this guy liked us, you know. So that's what kind of made me think about individual versus collective and the purpose of a collective effort over the individual.
I couldn't find mute. Yeah, interesting, right? I have a lifetime. Once I'm past my goals and aspirations for the world, unless I have a crazy amount of money and have this crazy trust or something, but that's probably not happening. Right? The USA will last a lot longer than me, knock on wood, and so will UCF and other organizations, right? So I do think that is interesting, the sustained partnership. Some of these problems will take generations to resolve, maybe. It can't just be overnight, right? So I do think that is a unique difference between even comparing the UCF to a larger entity above it, right? The state level or the federal level can be better for the recipients to be like, yes, this is like sustainable. We can like plan around this, like these needs we have. Matt, today, like a lot of the aid was recently removed, and now there's people that were working to deliver vaccines and etc. just don't have those materials anymore, and now they're like, can they even trust that we will help them again? Not in the foreseeable future, right? It's fascinating, right? So the U.S. though, or not the U.S., but the largest organizations, even though they will last a lot longer than an individual's lifetime, theoretically, when they back out, what is left behind? And as us citizens, I mean, do we have the power to fill in that gap if we thought it should be happening? I don't even know, honestly. Like if enough of us were passionate about making sure those vaccines were still delivered, can we do something about it? I don't even know, because I absconded my right to even think about that problem to my representative that I elected. It's sort of interesting, right? So thank you for bringing that up, Marcus. That was what made me think about it. I feel like we don't have an answer for Josh still about the democratic and the not the perception, but the difference of the influence, right?
It doesn't need to be that. That was just a thing we can put on the table, right? And obviously, there's also can just be the consequences discussion. Yeah. I should also play because we actually are at like 20 minutes.
So
We can broaden this to any of the early altruism versus non-altruism. So any of the early discussions should feel welcome at this point too. I want to leave the floor.
I want to say one more comment that relates to the consequences. So it kind of shifts the conversation, I guess, from this. But I wonder if we think of in terms of what is being given as aid, how that changes also our perception. Because it might also change the consequences, right? If you're giving money versus if you're giving a tangible good, they mentioned in the podcast, for instance, that matters, right? Because the money they can use for whatever they want. Tangible good, you're assuming what they need, right? But I want to take that a bit further. What if what you're giving is know-how? What if, and there's already people who go and do volunteer work and help whatever build buildings or help people learn how to, I don't know, farm sustainably, all sorts of activities that they do. Not to mention, religion, you have religious volunteers who go on spread the word of the religion, etc., help out with whatever needs, etc. So there is different kind of goods being given there as aid. But the consequences are significantly different in terms of, hey, I'm giving you money so you can take that and use it for whatever you think your society needs, versus, hey, I'm teaching you what you need to know in order to build institutions, infrastructure, etc., that you need in the future so that you don't have to rely on aid, whether this be, knowledge of how to farm, things like that, whether it's knowledge of how to build an industry, if the nation is still, not industrialized, or whatever else that may be, whether it's knowledge in terms of, how to build political, social capital, right? They were talking about trust as being essential for having an open society that flourishes, which I think is important. I don't know how you help people build trust within their country, especially if they have, if they're unfortunate to be in a corrupt nation where there is a lot of factions and distrust, sectarianism, etc. But I wonder the extent to which, it kind of shifts a bit the conversation because and I recognize saying that what you choose to teach them is also itself perhaps politically laden, right? The same way that goods can be, and it involves the same paternalistic approach. But it does seem fundamentally different in the sense that um, you're not just, you're giving this knowledge, they can take it, use it how they think will help their society, as opposed to you giving them something very neatly defined that they can use in very particular ways. That is how you think it's appropriate to use, right? Like you giving them vaccines, you think it's good to be vaccinated. It protects from illness. It protects from spreading the disease. It protects from death, etc., morbidity. Um, but if you give them knowledge, for instance, about how to create their own vaccines. And I recognize there's a lot of resource barriers there, of course, that you cannot as easily just start opening scientific research centers. But that knowledge can go much further than just them building the vaccines that they need, right? So in that sense, knowledge seems to be qualitatively different than just giving the resource itself. Um, so I just wanted to throw that out as a question to see if any of you have any thoughts about that kind of thing.
Can I complicate it a second just before even going further? Like, even allowed, like, there's a way in which, like, how we assess success or failure, I feel like it shifts dramatically, right? Based on what we're trying to do. So if I'm trying to educate you because I want you in my sphere of influence for political reasons, that's like, then we see, okay, are you in my influence or not? Versus if I'm trying to educate you because I believe deeply in autonomy and like whatever you do with that, right? It's going to change how we think about things, right? And so that I just want to say that, like, it feels like this could go further, but I do think there's certain goods, which is the key point I think you're trying to draw out, right? Is there's certain goods that, like, what becomes relevant for, actually, I'm not going to try and summarize, but I think you're right that there's an important distinction between the kinds of goods we're giving that's not just accessible based on, like, is it succeeding at what we're doing, but like what is even implied or carried with the idea of giving knowledge versus giving vaccines directly, or giving money versus giving
One thought I had about Alex with his comment, knowledge. To me, it sounded too, it's like you're trying to open new opportunities for them with this knowledge. They could take it and do something that betters themselves and their communities. It's in a way the same argument as the trade, not aid argument. Trade, by opening trade between nations, there's more opportunity for economic prosperity. So it feels like maybe the aid itself should be the opportunity for self-improvement. And I think the idea of backwards looking at reparations is like we took away their opportunities. We need to give back the opportunities. The problem is you can't control people, so they have to decide whether to take the opportunity or not, and they decide what their needs are, what they even aspire or want to do. And every person is unique. Not every city or state or nation can just be summarized into one goal. If we think we teach STEM, let's say, in a country, because we know STEM careers are so lucrative, that there's so many other areas of need. Like we still need arts and humanities and philosophy and and political philosophy, like to manage those systems. Business know-how. It's I wonder too, though, Alex. I mean, we are in an interconnected world now with the internet. Internet's really only made in the late '60s. I don't know when World Wide Web is like especially popular in the 90s. We're still very early in this interconnected world where everything's on YouTube and you can learn a lot on your own. So I feel like I wonder if like what kind of person would you reach that couldn't already get that knowledge in some way? And these places still have universities and um, schooling and education. I think what we're dancing around is what is the actual need and why do they need that? Is it because of a barrier? Is it because of their government? Is it because they're happy with what they have actually? And I'm not sure. I don't think anyone's happy to be impoverished or hungry or dying of disease, but um, it's fascinating to think about what I think just a general rule of thumb as we end this discussion about altruism for the semester. Never assume what a person needs. It is really my rule of thumb, and actually ask them what they want, figure out why they want it as well, so you can at least validate it won't be used for corrupt reasons, like building monuments and statues to dictators, let's say. And if the best way to serve them is through cash or through a gift in kind, you can decide at that point too. So I feel like that logic we apply it at the individual level, we apply it at the organizational and the state level. I just wish there was more deliberation at the higher and higher levels is the key, right? So that we can kind of build consensus. And it's not just one oligarchical decision making, let's say. So yeah, I think the trade, not aid, is most fascinating to me as a concept that the window of opportunity is open. Let's if we allow trade to happen, but in the case they talked about with China, it's like trade open, but they're still like an autocratic nation that doesn't allow free speech and represses certain types of viewpoints. So is it a net positive? Less people are dying, but now more people are under the thumb of a autocratic regime. So yeah, is it worth living in a horrible place? Is that's relative, right? To the opinion of the people. But that's kind of the problem area I see.
This is how I'm going to use this. I'm going to misuse what you said there at the end too. It's also like this, I think, brings to clear to me that there's something important for me. It feels like even in the political level about what the intentions or the goal is versus just the outcomes, right? Like China is a much higher trust society than the US, right? But there's something different going on there where like China's it's controlling the ecosphere of like what information people have. It's more oppressive and authoritarian, blah, blah, blah. And so it's like, well, if trust is what's important for reducing poverty, or one of the things that's important, China's found a thing that seems to work better. Our like hyper-polarized market approach to information is really bad for trust. We assume every issue is one where like we're on different sides. And so like, but maybe there's something good about our thing, which is that like authoritarianism is bad, and so however we realize trust, it has to be subject to certain limits. Or poverty is bad, but however we eradicate poverty has to be realized by certain limits. And so like this is a way in which I think like if we were moved by something about the fact that like China's success should be like discounted because this thing it does is very authoritarian, it doesn't give people these kinds of rights or these kinds of freedoms, that suggests I think that then maybe we are tempted, maybe we're wrong, but we're tempted by there being something more than like, how do we ensure there's an economic system that reduces poverty or that realizes trust or blah, blah, blah. And I'm honestly, I'm not sure how committed I am to different things, but I'm certainly tempted by the idea that like, yeah, China's the greatest success we know of, but something seemed to have went wrong there. Or like, yeah, the USSR took like essentially a serf society and made it compete against the US, but like they also had gulags and blah, blah, blah. And so something was going wrong there, even if it did seem to succeed by various metrics. And so I don't know, I guess that's what I'm trying to do self-interestedly is motivate political theory and philosophy as important things that need to be discussed further and further. And so there's really, again, no altruism even here. I'm just tooting my own horn and creating a market or whatever. No, sorry, I shouldn't have made, but yeah, it does suggest when we have this temptation to think, okay, something's wrong about how China's doing it. Well, maybe we're wrong about that, or maybe no, there is like, okay, well then what is it? What are we putting our finger on about China's authoritarianism that's drawing out, given I don't know, they're seeming relatively success at dealing with poverty. Or what.
I think
Other comments, yeah.
I'll just jump in real fast because I don't want it to escape that I really agree with the point that Jason said about opportunity, right? And generally I'm a fan of the capability approach, which really focuses on this idea of whether you have the opportunity to flourish, whether you choose to do so or not. Sen, who has one of the lead thinkers, who brings an example of being deprived of food, for instance, right? And you have two different people. One literally does not have food and is very skinny, sick because of that, etc. Another chooses not to eat for an ideological purpose, but they don't have to, they're not forced not to eat. These people, at a biological sense, if you look at them, essentially are the same, but they're not really the same because one of them has the opportunity to pursue a different lifestyle, but chooses not to. So I think such an approach of thinking about what opportunities to make available to others is really important, because you don't want to be paternalistic. But even in selecting, if you really minimize what you think about what deserves to be there as an opportunity for someone to accomplish, that itself can be paternalistic, right? So then how do you decide what people might need to flourish and how you distribute what it is you want to distribute as aid? And because I lean much on that, I tend to be a bit more worried about very, and it's not like I don't think ameliorative approaches of you have a particular problem, you have malaria, you have, lack of hygiene, etc. You need to solve that, and it improves lifestyle. It improves, chances of survival, it decreases illness, etc. I think that's important, and it's important to decrease harm as much as we can. But I think at the same time that we're doing that, we also need to think more broadly, to bring that to Josh's point about political philosophy, right? What is our overarching aim to accomplish? And that needs to be guiding efforts at aid at all time. And if what it's heading toward is something that's not very opportunity rich, but something that's very constricted and a very narrow vision, that is kind of an indication that it's probably not the best approach, especially if you're dealing with countries with different cultural backgrounds that might have different priorities, etc. How you accomplish that is a whole other question, of course.
Yeah. Also, yeah, the Senate news bomb. Honestly, it's kind of silly that we haven't had anything this quarter. I guess we didn't do a focus on political stuff in general, but the capabilities approach is very interesting. And I think it does a really good job of like appealing to my outcomes-based interests, but also recognizing that the outcomes thing can be too simplified. I wanted to flag one thing that definitely is like not summing up the quarter, but like capture something is like when we really think about aid and charity, I feel like in ordinary language there's often this thought of like kind of whatever you do is fine so long as you're trying to help, right? And it's just interesting how I didn't intentionally do this, but this is just kind of where the literature is. Very few of the discussions give any time to that simplified version, and so it seems like we've definitely, and maybe this is partly because it's responding to the status quo idea that any aid you give helps. There's been a lot of focus on outcomes and achievements here, such that now we're needing to like reinvigorate that, like, well, is there something important about what we're trying to do or how we do it or what our aims are, independent of just the outcome-based discussion. So like, certainly I don't think there's like anybody we've read or who's been on either sides of these discussions who's suggested like, so long as you're trying to help, that's okay. There was one person in the effective altruism thing who suggested something as close as we got to that about like, but really even she wasn't saying it because it was a mutual aid conception of like you're trying to benefit each other. And so I think that's a little bit interesting that like the discussions as they're happening aren't giving a lot of weight to that. It seems like there needs to be some consideration of, okay, am I trying to get what we're ostensibly trying to realize? Is poverty actually going down by this? Are we realizing more democracy? Are we, blah, blah, blah. Which is in some sense, if there is that much consensus on it, that's a sort of consensus that seems to be happening in this debate. Nobody seems to think they can actually hold the position that I don't know, if I talked to my grandma about it, would be like, well, so long as you're trying to help, it doesn't matter. That's not fair to my grandma. She wouldn't be like that, but yeah. Other final thoughts. That's my sum up now. So I'm stopping my sum up, but we have time.
Yeah, maybe the only thing I would end with is just how complicated it gets. And that's probably true for just about any theme each semester, but yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how, if we were to have the same conversation, I don't know, in 3-4 years, what types of things would be changing? What would we miss the good old days of, yeah, just anything would help? I don't know. But overall, just really interesting podcasts and conversations to follow. So thanks for putting this together. Honestly, this was awesome.
That's what I wanted to say too, is just thank you for the theme this semester has been really, I've thought about it outside of these meetings. I've talked about it with other people. Some of the concepts that's been relevant, the discussion. And yeah, as someone that I volunteer frequently, I donate. I think it's important for me to have these thoughts in the back of my mind. Yeah, not all aid is without strings that are in impact, and to not take everything at face value about suggestions either way. It's a really complex issue.
Yeah, I'm gonna admit I reactivated my monthly donation that I was doing. Like it actually had stopped, and then there's like, oh, well, I was like, right, this helped me there. On the discussions, oh yeah, thank you, whatever, blah blah blah. But if folks are interested, next term, Jonathan Beaver, I think he's gonna be leading it. If you have suggestions or things you want to chat about or talk about, we're always welcoming input. So you can either email me directly or and I can pass to Dr. Beaver, or you can email Dr. Beaver. But these discussions are more interesting and more enjoyable when people are not just foisted a topic, but actually they're like, I want to discuss this. And so if you feel like there's a topic, it doesn't need to be a theme for the whole quarter even. That's not something we always do. So if there's something like, I would really love to discuss this, that sort of suggestion is super, super, super helpful for us. Because I know even when Alex was setting up, like there's so much material out there. And it's like, what should I choose? Well, if you have a topic you think is interesting, or even better, you have a podcast that you really love and like, wow, wouldn't it be great to get some philosophical lens on this? Send that stuff along. Cool. Thank you everybody for coming. Like this was a good group. It was honestly it was a smaller than sometimes, but also it's really stable, which I enjoyed. I enjoyed the I felt like the nice to see you again, Alex, but it felt like the four of us, I was seeing you guys so regularly that it was like kind of developing some themes. So
Thanks.